Okay, I've made a decision that might end up costing me $600 or $700, but my rear spindle and bearings are good. There's absolutely no play in them. But I do want to take them apart so that I can paint the trailing arm properly and paint the dust shield and the piece there that holds the spindle. So what I am going to do is I'm going to try something a little bit different from the usual recommendation to press out the spindle. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this nut off. I'm going to attempt to pull this plate here that the spindle goes into with a little gear puller. We'll see how that works. If that doesn't work, then I'm going to have to fabricate a jig to support here and over here, and they're not the same heights, so I will have to have that lifted up so that there's room to press the spindle out, and then I'll use it in my press. Just realized that you couldn't see the places I'm going to support. Okay, we'll go over that again. I'm going to build a jig to support it here and here. So we shall take that nut off and see what happens. My logic in taking apart the spindle is that since there is no play in it now, I should not have to change any of the internal parts, any of the bearings, any of the races, any of the spacers, any of the shims, so that I should be able to take this apart, put it back together with the same identical pieces, and end up with zero play. And if that doesn't happen, then we'll either have to come up with different shims to make it zero play, or I will have to invest in a rebuilt trailing arm. Okay, that was a 1 1/16 inch socket required for that. Required a little bit of beating on it with the impact wrench. That's a 600 foot-pound in reverse impact wrench, so it's no lightweight. But the only thing I had holding the spindle from spinning was these lug nuts on the board, 2 of them, 1 on each side. And that actually was enough to keep it from spinning, and it came off. So, not too bad. Next, okay, that was easy. I thought I was going to have to press that out, or pull that out with a puller. But it came right out. So, now to get the spindle out. Since that didn't need to be pulled off, I'm going to have to see what's next here. There are 4 bolts that appear to be holding this piece of the trailing arm on. I'm going to take those off next and see what happens. What I'm going to attempt to do is to press the spindle out of the trailing arm by using a puller on the trailing arm. We'll see how that works. Not going to work well that way. Let's try it. Put it down. going to do is get a socket, put it on my impact wrench and try this. Okay, here we go, trying it with the impact wrench. That sound was the floor slipping off of the trailing arm, not the spindle popping loose. Okay, it took a trip to the press in order to get that out. But now all I have to do is take this nut off. And the spindle is out. Here's the nut. Spindle is out. There's the spindle with the bearing and spacers. Not too bad of a job with the press once I got it set up so that I could support the parts that needed support. Okay, I've got the trailing arm positioned as it would be on the car. Since this is the left side or driver's side, this part would hook into the frame. Shock and strut mount would be on the bottom. Place for the caliper on the top. I'm going to zoom in on the emergency brake setup so that I can get a good picture of how that is supposed to go back together. Okay, a couple things to note. The springs basically look symmetrical, but they go in on the top of the shoes. In other words, the hook goes through from the top to attach them to the shoes, so it holds the shoes together. The star wheel for the adjuster is towards the front of the car, so it points towards the spot where it mounts on the body. In order to take these springs out, you can get your fingers through the little holes, at least on one side, to hold the back, and just press in on these and turn them. Gonna need a tool to do that, so okay, there's no cup or anything on the brake shoe itself. The spring just rests up against it with the retainer in the spring. I'll try to get the pin out. Fell out easily. Pin goes through the retainer and then twists to lock it in place. I'm going to remove now the other springs, the other retainer, and it should all come off. There is one clip here at the top. I can't tell whether that's going to come out or not. It might be attached behind that bolt. We shall see. Okay, I've got both of the clips off, and it occurred to me that I may be able to just spread these brake shoes at the top and slip them off because they're free at the bottom. If I can do that, and don't have to take them apart. Maybe I won't have to even adjust them when I put them back on. This is the emergency brake lever right here. That probably will come off after I take the backing plate off. This retainer pin here, tough to get to. You can kind of, if you got small enough hands. You can't. Okay, yeah, I see what's happening. There is a metal part behind it that is going to prevent this from coming out until you take the plate off. So hopefully that will be enough to allow us to get it back on easily. While it's still fresh in my memory, this is the parking brake lever. And it's easy to put in. You take that loop, turn it towards the backing plate. It will fit down through the backing plate, and then you rotate this. That just fits in there like that. So coming out, it's rotate up to 3 o'clock, then to 12 o'clock, slips right out. Going back in, goes in at 12 o'clock, rotate to 3 o'clock. Rotate it halfway again, and that's how it connects. The nuts that hold the backing plate to the spindle mount are 9/16. I'll take those off now. As soon as I get these unstuck, I can continue. There's one of them anyway. So those 4 are off. The spindle is, or the backing plate is still not going to come out because of this top bolt. I'll have to see what kind of a wrench I need for that. And there's a little tab bent over. I'm going to have to bend it back so I can get the wrench on, or the socket on. Okay, it just took a little bit of bending of those tabs, and I can get a 3/4 socket on here. That bolt went all the way through this mounting piece. So you got the mounting piece, you have the brake shoe retainer, mounting piece, brake shoe retainer, bolt. And now the dust cover is coming off, and I'm going to be able to get this pin. That pin, it's going to be very important to get that pin back through this hole in the dust cover before we get the dust cover on, or it's not going to be able to be put on. So we want to make sure we're not having to take the dust cover back off in order to replace it. So now I should be able to get the spindle carrier separated from the trailing arm itself. But before I do that, I'm going to make some mental notes on how that goes on. The shock mount goes to the bottom, and in order to determine what the top of it is, you have the parking brake cable mounts pointing towards the top. Okay, so we'll have to see. This will probably have to be pried away from the trailing arm, or hammered off or something. We'll have to see what we can do with it. Okay, what I did is I supported the trailing arm on pieces of wood so that this was off of the ground here, or off the bottom of the bench here. And it took me exactly 3 blows with a hammer, dead blow hammer, to loosen that. So now I can take that spindle support off. Actually, that's not the spindle support, that's the bearing race, bearing holder. Nonetheless, it can come off and we can proceed to the next piece. I guess it wasn't the bearing race, it's, I guess I don't know what the part is called. Caliper mount to that. Because there's the bolts to bolt the caliper to, I'm sure. And this hole goes to the top. And now we have to address getting the actual spindle piece off, if it's not welded on. It doesn't appear to be. So we will support this again. Put some nuts on it so that we can catch it without it falling. I have to do some looking at that and see exactly whether that comes off or not. Okay, that is going to come off. What I did is I noticed that there was a little bit of clearance in between these bolts, the studs. So I whacked this that way, and that way again, and it didn't take much effort. I don't know if you can see, but that's starting to get some separation right in there. So I'm sure with a little more coaxing, this will just come off just nicely. Just need to figure out what the proper sweet spots for it are. Maybe a little screwdriver behind it to pry it off a little bit and it should come off. I don't think it's going to be much of a problem at all. Okay, what seemed to be the magic bullet for getting that spindle support off, I supported the trailing arm on some blocks. I got a screwdriver on one end, held down on my arm with the other end and lifted with the screwdriver and on the other end of the shock and strut support, and just pried on it. Out she comes. Okay, my trailing arm is now stripped except for the joint where it goes into the frame. I will have to investigate. I believe I'm going to put poly with graphite impregnated, the black ones. So I'll have to see what I have to do to take that out before I proceed with that. This is the trailing arm from the right or passenger side of the car. Just a couple things to note. This is the way you'd be looking at it on the car. One of the studs has been broken off. It will need to be replaced. Big thing I want to point out here is that the star wheel for adjusting the parking brake is to the rear of the car. I am going to be taking this apart so that I can clean it up and paint it. Right now there is no play in the spindle. I've checked that already. I hope to be able to take it apart, put it back together without changing that. Before I take off the shock mount, I want to get the orientation straight. They point to the top side of the trailing arm. It's actually backwards of the way it should be apart. So they are to the top side of the trailing arm, and they point back. The tabs point back in the same direction that the shock mount points, and that would actually be to the outside of the car. Okay, I've heard it said that you can't take apart a trailing arm, even if it's good, and put it back together without pulling the bearing off, because you can't get this seal to seat back into the carrier. Well, I found a way to do it. This is the second trailing arm. The first one is done, and I have zero play in it, just like I had before I started. What I did, I made out of PVC pipe, two little shims, if you will. And what I did is I placed them underneath the edge of the seal here. That was step number one. And then what I do is I put it into the carrier, and I start to draw that in by tightening up the nut from the back side that holds the flange on. Once I get the bushing, or the seal rather, to seat, then I can take a screwdriver, reach in there in those two little gaps between those two shims, knock those shims out of there, and continue to put it together. And it worked on the other one. I have zero play, just like I had before I tore it apart. The grease that's in there is not a very thin grease. It'll stick and stay in there, so you don't have to worry about the grease coming out. That seal is there mainly to keep dirt from getting in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some fresh grease on that bearing, and then when I'm done with that, I'll start putting it into the trailing arm. Okay, that's not a very sturdy bench to work on there, so this is more for demonstration purposes than anything else. I'm just going to, the bearing didn't come out of the inside here, so I didn't take it out. Okay. That's as far as she'll go on without coaxing it. So what I'll do now is if I put this on, that won't fit. Just to coax that down onto that bearing so it gives me room to work. I'm going to take my dead blow hammer and smack it on till I get it far enough on so that I can use my nut to tighten her down. Okay, I had to resort to using the 30mm socket I had that fit around that shaft so I didn't mess up the threads. A few taps with that with the dead blow hammer, pushed it down. We're ready to start. Put that on. Here's a little trick I learned. You're going to have to torque that to 100 pounds. So, you can't hold it still by itself, but if you take your tire, put it down on the ground, take your trailing arm, and put the studs through the holes in the rim. Now what you have is something that will hold that. You can sit on that tire and you can torque it down. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to just tighten it down until I get that seal pushed into the housing, and I'm going to take it and pop those couple of shims out, and we should be able to get it to good to go. Okay, here we are after we've tightened that in a bit. The shims, for lack of a better word, that I made to put in there have actually fallen at. And you can see the seal is mostly seated, and all I have to do, take my big screwdriver in there, put it on the edge of that seal, pry it against the hub, and oops, hard to do this with one hand, but prying it against the hub, I'm able to seat that seal all the way in. So I'm not done torquing the nut on the other end to 100 foot-pounds yet, but that's all I have left to do, and she's back on. There we are, trailing arm is on, actually on both sides. Not really a problem, just biggest problem was I had put port 15 on the bolt that holds the trailing arm on, and I had to kind of work it through between that and the paint that got into the hole. Had to work it through so that I could get it on. That was the biggest problem, that and the weight of the thing. As you can see, I've supported it with several 2x, but they are both on. And there's the look at the left side. The torque on this nut here is 50 pounds. I put the shims in as close to what was originally on there as possible, but keep in mind that there's new bushings, so they were different. We'll have to check it after it is done and see what the alignment looks like.